The collective anguish of Parliament. MPs brought back from summer recess to debate the failure of a mission that claimed 457 British lives. Boris Johnson described what the UK would do in the aftermath.
Our efforts must be focused on supporting the Afghan people in the region itself, particularly those fleeing conflict or the threat of violence. We therefore call on the United Nations to lead a new humanitarian effort in this region.
The government has announced a new refugee resettlement scheme, instantly called unambitious by critics, that aims to bring 20,000 of those most in need to Britain over the next few years. And despite promises to evacuate up to 10,000 people who've worked with the UK mission, Afghans resident in the UK protested outside.
We just want something to the Parliament do for our families back home. They served for them for the last 20 years and they can't leave them behind like this. That picture speaks for everything.
Do you feel the government is doing enough to help the people who helped it?
No, never.
Back in the House, among questions about the failure of UK intelligence and the Prime Minister's absence on holiday as the crisis unfolded last week, there was a powerful indictment of the West's withdrawal from a military veteran on the government's own backbench.
Nations mobilise and muster. Nations determine and have patience. And here we've demonstrated, sadly, that we, the West, the United Kingdom, does not. Now this is a harsh lesson for all of us.
Amid sometimes emotional interventions by MPs and despite the government's best efforts to talk up some of the successes of the past 20 years in Afghanistan, there was no disguising the fact that it simply hadn't foreseen or been prepared for the speed with which Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, and that in fact this was all a rather grand-scale humiliation. The leader of a leading member of the NATO alliance force to admit to Parliament here that its nationals and support staff were only able to leave Kabul at all because the Taliban was allowing them to. In the end, the debate, a simple motion that this House consider the situation in Afghanistan, could achieve little more than that. Jonah, Al Jazeera, London.
Heino Klink is the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. He joins us live now from Alexandria in Virginia. Heino Klink, welcome to the NewsHour. The strategic balance was in balance. The status quo was basically okay. In that sense, should the US have stayed put?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Peter. I would tell you to state the obvious that current events have certainly demonstrated that we should have maintained, the United States and its allies should have maintained a footprint in Afghanistan, not only to contend with the potential rise again of terrorist threats in Afghanistan that can threaten the United States, its partners and interests, but also, and perhaps equally importantly, to maintain a forward presence in the new challenges that the United States faces in terms of great power competition with China and Russia.
Does it make the United States, or does it make any other former countries who had a presence in Afghanistan potentially a target now? You know, 4 days ago on this channel, we were reporting on how the Taliban basically unlocked the doors of the prison contained inside the Bagram Air Base. 5,000 inmates, a lot of ISIL people, a lot of Al-Qaeda people, and there is that kind of hawkish John Bolton mindset in America now that says, look, what Biden has done is take us back to pre-9/11 and set us up for potentially something not dissimilar to 9/11.
Well, I would say the threat has exponentially increased. We saw in recent history, when we pulled out of Iraq precipitously and prematurely, that allowed for the ISIS caliphate to take hold. And we saw that ISIS not only terrorized people within the Middle East, but exported or at least certainly supported followers in other parts of the world, in Europe and in Southeast Asia, to launch attacks. And of course, we know, we are all here in the United States in particular, very clear on the history of 9/11 and that Afghanistan let me just say, a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan allowed for a sanctuary from which Al-Qaeda was able to plan, organize, and train in a way that allowed them to attack the U.S. homeland. I think the events of the last several days have certainly increased the risk of that reoccurring, as well as potentially a reemergence of, again, other terrorist entities using Afghanistan as a sanctuary.
Do you think in the White House or in the State Department, anyone is feeding the kind of advice, the kind of information that you're taking us through now back to the White House? Or to put it another way, do we have to kind of shake up the kaleidoscope that is Afghanistan? Because if you take the word Taliban out of Afghanistan now, you could say it's nothing more than a very, very big drugs cartel. It plants the drugs, it harvests them, it sells them, it gets the profit, it launders the money, it buys the guns to use and protect and enclose the country. I can't really see a difference between that and what was going on in some South American countries on a much smaller scale in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s.
You raised some very valid points and some very valid concerns. I think, again, if you take a macro look, though, and again, I would draw your attention to the role of Afghanistan in the new context of great power competition. The Taliban now in charge of Afghanistan has already reached out to the CCP-led government in Beijing. It is likely that China will establish diplomatic relations with the Taliban-led Afghanistan. That will give Chinese unfettered access to great earth minerals, and in return will fill Taliban coffers with renminbi. What the Taliban will use those types of resources for, I would presume will only be malign activities, given their history both in power as well as an insurgent force and a supporter of international terrorism. So I think the issue is more acute than, let's say, a cartel operating in the Western Hemisphere. Those are some of my concerns.
Heino Kling, really good to get your opinion on this still developing massive local and regional event. Thank you so much for joining us here on the NewsHour. We do appreciate it. Heino Kling talking to us there from the United States.